Be seated. I want the times we live in to be praying times. I want the Christians of our day to be praying Christians. I want the church to be a praying church. I want those who have never yet prayed to arise and call upon God. Now, I find those words pretty stirring, and they're the stirring words of an Anglican bishop, not Stuart, somebody a little bit older, a little bit more English, Bishop J.C. Ryle, who lived, he died in 1900, so over 100 years ago he spoke those words. And those words came to mind as I read the passage that Mavanwi read for us about Peter in Acts 12. The early church was a praying church. The early Christians were praying Christians. And what our Bible passage presents us with is a powerful picture of prayer, of answered prayer. Let's just put things in context. The early church was growing in numbers, but as they grew in numbers, opposition was also growing. And one source of opposition was the Roman-appointed ruler of Judea and Samaria, and also actually quite a broad area, Herod Agrippa. This Herod is not Herod the Great, that's his grandfather. Herod the Great was ruling at the time when Jesus was born. This Herod is not Herod Antipas. That Herod was active when Jesus was being arrested and tried. This Herod Agrippa is a few years later, and he is ruling, as I say, quite that large area, and he's on the rampage, arresting and persecuting church leaders. Why? Well, reason one is that he's anxious to preserve the Roman peace in Palestine, and therefore he disliked minorities who might cause some sort of disruption, who were in danger of actually disrupting that peace. Reason two, we actually heard in the reading. His actions won favour with the Jews, and he was trying to ingratiate himself with the Jews who didn't look favourably upon either his Roman upbringing or the fact that he had a little bit of a questionable ancestry. And so Herod had some who belonged to the church arrested, we are told. And he had James, the brother of John, put to death by the sword, beheaded, we are told. And he had Peter arrested and put in prison under guard, we're told, awaiting a trial, a show trial, which would be followed by his execution. So the situation looks extremely bleak for Peter and other church leaders, even hopeless. What would the little community of Jesus, in its powerlessness, do against the might of Herod with his Roman backing? I read verse 5. Peter was kept in prison, but the church was earnestly praying for him. The church was earnestly praying for him, and then this is what transpires, and you've heard it and you've seen it. Peter receives a visitor, a messenger, an angel, while he's sleeping. He wakes, the guards continue to sleep, his chains fall off, he dresses and gathers together his belongings, he makes it past another set of guards and through iron gates. The angel, the visitor, the messenger leaves him. And Peter finds his way to a home where many people were gathered and praying for him. And they're astonished. And he describes his escape. And they're overjoyed. And then he leaves them, heading off to find, no doubt, a safer place, a place where he won't be found. It's a colourful and dramatic story. And amongst many other things, and there's lots that I could say, it illustrates what I said before, that the early church was a praying church. The early Christians were praying Christians. And this story is a story that tells the answer to their prayers. Now, I want to turn from Acts to John's Gospel. Our Gospel reading, the one that Elaine read, and then try to make a bit of a connection between the two passages. So our Gospel reading. A new commandment I give you, love one another, Jesus said. As I have loved you, so you love one another, Jesus said. People will know that you are my disciples if you love one another, he says. 3 times. Love one another. Love one another. Love one another. Don't know whether any of you remember, and there's lots of songs that have set those words to music, but there was a song back in the 70s we used to sing in youth group. We are one in the Spirit, we are one in the Lord. I won't sing it for you. But they'll know we are Christians. They'll know we are Christians by our love, by our love. They will know that we are Christians by our love. Not by our statements of faith, not by this, not by that. They'll know we're Christians by our love for one another. And today I want to make a simple point that one way to do this, one way to love one another, as Jesus said, it's a new commandment I give to you. As I've loved you, love one another, so that the world might know that you're my disciples, love one another. And one way of doing that is to pray for one another. It's not the only way, of course. There are practical things to do. There's food to be cooked and distributed. There are people to be visited. There's all sorts of things. There are other words to be spoken. There's listening. There's presence. There's generosity. There's acceptance. It's not one thing or the other. But there is prayer. And prayer is a love language. When Peter was in jail, the church prayed for him. There wasn't much else they could do, but pray they could and pray they did. Out of desperation, out of fear of losing Peter, so in fear and trembling they pray, and out of love for him, they prayed for him. There was a popular book. It wasn't an academic book, but it was a book that many people read around 20 or 30 years ago, I think in the 90s. But people still read it and pick it up. It's by Gary Chapman. It's called The 5 Love Languages. And he develops the idea that different people like to demonstrate and are wired up, hardwired to demonstrate love in different ways. Maybe one person seeks to convey love by words of appreciation, words of affirmation. Another person might tend to show their love by doing tasks, by helping people with chores, practical assistance, that sort of thing. Or for somebody else it might be by physical touch, by a hug, by physical affection. Or somebody else's preferred mode of expression might be through generosity, through gift giving or giving other things. Or it might be quality time. That's how people like to convey their love, by giving their time and spending quality time with somebody. And just as people like to express their love in those ways, argued Gary Chapman, so people love to receive love in different ways. And for some people, it's one of those things. Some people might sense themselves loved by having quality time. For some people, being helped might not do the job. But hearing words of affirmation or appreciation might go very deep indeed, and they might sense themselves loved in that way. Well, this morning, I'm trying to say that prayer is a love language. That prayer is a language that we might use to convey that we care. And for some people, having us pray might be a sign that we do. Here's how we might put into practice those words of Jesus, which he said 3 times. Love one another, love one another, love one another. As I have loved you, that people might know that you're my disciples, this new command I give to you. I'm reminded of the story of the Apostle John, and it's recorded by Jerome in one of his commentaries in about the 4th century. And he writes how when the Apostle John was very old, when he was frail and he couldn't make his way to church on Sundays, he would be carried, he'd be helped, he'd be supported by his friends. And he'd come to church and he would be invited to speak. And he would say the same words each time. Little children, I say to you, love one another. Little children, I say to you, love one another. And this went on week after week after week, until at last, more than a little weary of hearing exactly the same words each week. He was asked, "Why do you always say this?" And the Apostle John is reported to have said, "Because it is the Lord's command. And if this only is done, it is enough." We've got no way of verifying that story, but it certainly sounds, if you read John's letters, if you read the gospel that we had recorded today, it certainly sounds like something that he might say. So there we go. Love one another. We're called upon to love one another, and to pray for one another. Prayer as a love language, not as a substitute for action, but maybe as a spur to action, something that gives us the strength, the courage, the resolve to act in all sorts of ways. Prayer as a love language. I want the times we live in to be praying times. I want the Christians of our time to be praying Christians. I want the church to be a praying church. And I want those who have never prayed yet to arise and to call upon God. Amen. Amen.